Let's now talk about spousal relief. There are situations where it is unfair for one spouse to bear the responsibility of the mistakes of another spouse in various situations. Some of them perhaps being mistakes that were made in prior life before their marriage, in which case the existing spouse really, it would be unfair to hold them responsible for any debts that the other spouse may have. So we'll go on from here. So there are two types of spousal relief. There is the injured spouse relief and the innocent spouse relief. So let's talk about the difference between the two because they're often confused with each other. The injured spouse, which is in scope for the Tax-Aide program, is a situation where past due debts owned by one spouse have the ability to be excused or not be held responsible for the other spouse, such as unpaid child support, unpaid prior year tax obligations, unpaid student loan debts, those types of things. Often these debts are accrued during prior marriages or prior relationships and are brought into a new marriage, and it's really unfair to hold the innocent spouse or the injured spouse responsible for having to pay the debts of another individual. So the IRS provides these two types of relief, injured spouse and innocent spouse, but neither one of them are guarantees that the innocent spouse will be relieved of those obligations, but there's a very strong chance that they will be. So if these forms are filled out and submitted, there is a pretty good chance that they'll be excused from those debts. So we're going to talk in more detail about injured spouse because it is more in scope. But let's now talk about innocent spouse, which is out of scope. Innocent spouse is a situation where the innocent spouse is really unaware of erroneous tax returns that may have been filed by the guilty spouse. There may be unreported income, for instance, that may have been reported on by the guilty spouse, and there may have been incorrect deductions taken or credits that were inappropriately taken, or just claiming the wrong cost basis on something. So these are situations now that could exist within the marriage. However, usually the innocent spouse is unaware that these things have taken place. So the guilty spouse may be the one that always does the tax returns every year, may simply do them fraudulently, not claiming some income or not or claiming excessive deductions that they're not entitled to. Those kinds of things. Sometimes these things go on for years, and the innocent spouse is completely unaware, other than the fact that the innocent spouse signs the return every year. Apart from that, they really have no knowledge of any of the details in the tax return. So the guilty spouse is getting away with creating these fraudulent tax returns, and the innocent spouse discovers it later on and then can apply for this relief. So that explains the difference between the two. Now we're going to get into the injured spouse and talk in detail about that. Injured spouse form 8379. Details. So the IRS may offset or reduce a tax refund for either spouse's outstanding debt. Common IRS offsets that we typically see are past due child or spousal support, federal non-tax debts and student loans, federal or state tax debts, or state unemployment debts. The injured spouse is, in fact, a spouse that does not have the responsibility for the debt. So the injured spouse has a choice. They can either file married filing separate each year to avoid having to deal with their spouse's debt, or they can file jointly with Form 8379, the Injured Spouse Allocation Form. So we're going to go through the Injured Spouse Allocation Form in this presentation, and I just wanted to note that why wouldn't they want to file married filing separately? Well, typically, mailing and filing separately would exclude them from being able to claim a number of different um, adjustments to their income or credits. So married filing separate usually is not a very favorable way to file a tax return unless you have something so simple that you don't otherwise qualify for any of these adjustments or credits. So there are some people that can file married filing separately and it doesn't really hurt them, but there are other people, for instance, people that may be paying back student loans, they would be excluded from being able to claim that adjustment on their tax return for what they pay in student loans. So in that case, they might be better off filing a Form 8379. Let's talk about some of the requirements for filing injured spouse. First of all, only one spouse can be the one that owes past due debts. Secondly, the tax return in question here must have an overpayment or a refund due to the taxpayers. If, in fact, the tax return is a balance due situation and is not a refund, you cannot use this form. So it has to be a tax return with a refund due to the taxpayers. The injured spouse must not be legally obligated to pay the debts of the other spouse. And the injured spouse must also have made tax payments such as tax withholding on W-2s or 1099s, or also they may have made estimated payments during the year. Or they could possibly be claiming a refundable tax credit such as earned income tax credit. So all of those things have to be looked at. The injured spouse form can only be filed if those requirements are met. Form 8379 can either be mailed by itself or can be electronically filed with the tax return. If it's mailed by itself and the joint return has already been filed and a refund has already been held by the IRS to pay the debt, then anytime within 3 years after the return was originally filed, you can file the Form 8379 by mailing it in. You should include copies of all source documents for both spouses showing income tax withheld as part of the mailing that you send them. But we're going to focus on Form 8379 being electronically filed with the tax return, since that's what we do, and we can use Tax-Aide to do that, and we're going to talk about the details in upcoming slides. So here's the beginning of Form 8379, Part 1. So here you need to report the tax year that you're filing this form for. And so it can be for the current year or it can be for any one of the 3 prior years. So this can be filed after the tax return has been filed for any particular year as an afterthought. And as long as you fill it out completely, include any of the documents from the prior years that needed to be mailed in. And you have to understand that this is not a guarantee. When you mail this form in, this is not a guarantee that the taxpayer is going to be granted injured spouse status. I think it's very likely that they will be granted, but it is not a guarantee. And it could delay the tax return for as many as 14 weeks. So you need to make it clear to the taxpayer that they may not see their refund for 14 weeks, which is a considerable length of time. So let's go through this thing one step at a time. So, and after entering the tax year, you're going to go to number 2, and you're going to say, did you or will you file a joint tax return? And typically the answer would be yes, and they would go to step number 3. Did or will the IRS use the joint overpayment to pay any of the following legally enforceable past due debts owed only by your spouse? And that would include federal tax, state income tax, state unemployment compensation, child support, spousal support, federal non-tax debts such as student loans. So typically, the answer would be yes, because you do have the innocent spouse does have a spouse that does have one of these debts that they are past due on, and so they would go to line number 4. Now, notice here, in both of these cases, number 2 and number 3, if you answered no to either one of these things, do not file this form. You are not an injured spouse. Also, there's this note here: if the past due amount is for a federal tax liability owed by both you and your spouse, you may qualify for what's called innocent spouse relief for the year to which the joint overpayment was or will be applied. See innocent spouse relief in the instructions. So, as I said before, innocent spouse is out of scope for us, but just to give you a little more knowledge, this might be a situation where the other spouse had committed fraud on a prior tax return and the innocent spouse was unaware of it. The problem with the innocent spouse form, from my experience, is that the innocent spouse form puts the innocent spouse in a situation where they basically have to drop the ball, so to speak, on their spouse by using this form. So this could be a very contentious situation between two spouses, and I have found that it's very difficult to convince a taxpayer to do this when they, in essence, are turning in their other spouse for doing something fraudulent. So moving right along, on number 4, are you legally obligated to pay this past due amount? And if you, as the innocent spouse, are legally obligated to pay it, then of course you shouldn't be filing this form, and it says to stop here. And again, it talks about the innocent spouse form, possibly. 5A, were you a resident of a community property state at any time during the tax year entered on line 1? Well, we don't have a community property state in Massachusetts or anywhere close by, to my knowledge, so we're going to skip right over that. The answer is going to be no, and skip line 5B and go to line 6. So 5B, was your marriage recognized under the law? So it talks about the community property state, and again, that is irrelevant to us. So line 6, did you make and report payments such as federal income tax withholding or estimated tax payments? So typically, the innocent spouse would have perhaps had a job and would have had federal withholding taken out of their W-2, so you would answer yes to that. So it says skip lines 7 through 9 and go to part 2. So this ends part 1, and we're going to go to the next slide. And here we have part 2, information about the joint tax return for which this form is filed. So enter the following information exactly as is shown on the tax return. So here you would enter the first name, middle initial, last name of the primary taxpayer, the first person on the tax return, and they're the secondary person on the tax return. You would also include their social security numbers, and whichever one is the injured spouse would check this box, whether it's the primary or the secondary, you check the appropriate box. Check this box number 11 only if you want your refund issued to both names. Otherwise, separate refunds will be issued for each spouse if applicable. So you could check that box if you wanted to come to both of you as a joint recipient. Or number 12, do you want any injured spouse refund mailed to an address different from the one on your tax return? So if that was the case, you'd answer yes to that. So that's parts 1 and 2 of Form 8379. Now keep in mind, we're not talking about TaxSlayer at this point. We're talking about a paper 8879. So if you were to fill this out by downloading Form 8379 from irs.gov, you would fill it out manually, and you would mail it in with copies of the prior year tax return, or whatever tax return this relates to. Let's go to part 3. So here's where we do the nuts and bolts of what's going on here. So in column 1, the amount shown on the joint return for each one of these categories: income, adjustments to income, standard deduction, number of exemptions, credits, other taxes, federal income tax withheld, and payments. And then you would have allocated to the injured spouse. So of your W-2 income, how much of it belonged to the injured spouse? How much of it belonged to the other spouse? So you would essentially break apart all of these different categories and allocate to each spouse what their portion would be. And thereby the IRS can determine how much of the tax refund can be protected for the benefit of the innocent spouse. Now keep in mind there has to be a refund here. If there's no refund, you cannot file this form. So the beauty of doing it in the current tax year, so if you have somebody at your site that has this situation and would benefit from using the injured spouse tax, the 8379, you can do this as part of TaxSlayer. You can go into TaxSlayer, you can fill this form out, and the advantage here is that the math is done by TaxSlayer. So all of this information in column A would be filled in by TaxSlayer based on the information that you've put in when you were preparing the tax return. And also, the information in column C would be calculated by TaxSlayer. It's just the information in column B that would have to be entered on the computer. So that, I think, pretty much explains part 3. And part 4, of course, is only for signatures. And in TaxSlayer, I'm not sure whether you would sign the form, print the form out and have them sign it. They would probably keep that signed form within their packet in any case, but I don't think there's any way to electronically sign it, but I'm not entirely sure of that. So I've gone through the form in TaxSlayer myself, but I have not completed the form, so I haven't gone to this stage yet. So that remains to be seen, and you can figure that out when you get there. So here you can see, this is from TaxSlayer. You can see that on column A, all the amounts have been filled out by TaxSlayer itself, and then the amount allocated to the injured spouse, you plug in the numbers that belong to the injured spouse, and then column C would be calculated by TaxSlayer. So you can refer to Pub 4012, your volunteer resource guide, tab O, Navigating TaxSlayer for Injured Spouse, and that will walk you through the process. If you need a little refresher, you can go to that tab O and get a refresher on how to do that. Or you can go back to this video. Proceed to the Injured Spouse form, Form 8379 in TaxSlayer. You can bring that form up by going to the upper left corner where you can enter a form number. You can bring up any form that way, W-2 or 1099. Just enter Form 8379. Actually, you can just put the number in. You don't have to put the word form in. 8379, and it'll find the form for you. You can just click on it and bring it up. The form does not guarantee, as I said before, the form does not guarantee outcome and can delay the refund for up to 14 weeks. So, review all the documents to allocate the proper amount of income, deductions, additional taxes, and taxes withheld, and credits to the injured spouse. So make sure that everything is split up so that the injured spouse gets the benefit of whatever they have allocated to them. Do not allocate earned income tax credit because the IRS will determine that allocation themselves. So stay away from that. And a little quiz. Jack and Jill Murphy are married and want to file married filing separate because Jack owes back child support and their refund will be offset. What other options do they have? They can file married filing jointly with Form 8379 injured spouse allocation. So if, for instance, one of them qualified for getting credit or getting an adjustment to their income for having paid student loan interest, married filing separate would exclude them from being able to use that benefit unless they filed jointly and filed the Form 8379 with their tax return. So what probing questions do we need to ask the Murphys? Is Jill legally obligated to pay any of these debts? Because if she is not, she can qualify to use the injured spouse form. If she does share responsibility for the debts that exist, then she's not going to be able to use that form. Did Jill make any tax payments, such as withholding from her W-2s, tax withholding from her 1099s? Perhaps she made quarterly estimated payments, or she's in a position where she wants to claim the earned income tax refund, which is a refundable credit. In any of those cases, of course, she's entitled to have, assuming that she's not responsible for any of the debts, she is in line to have her part of the refund preserved and sent to her, even though normally the IRS would keep that entire refund to pay off that debt. So that's basically the injured spouse form, and that's the end of our discussion for today. Thanks for listening.